you know, a lot of people have made New Year's resolutions or New Year's goals or plans or those kind of things. It's kind of something that people do this time of year, and perhaps you have made yours as well, and I hope that you're doing well 9 days in, and because some have already, I think, given up. But somebody had posted the last 4 years of resolutions, and I just want to throw this out there. It just said, in 2018, somebody wrote, he says, I will read at least 12 good books a year. In 2019, they resolved, I will read at least 6 good books a year. In 2020, they put, I will read 3 books a year. In 2021, they said, I will go back and finish the first book I started 3 years ago. That sounds about right. Of course, their second resolution they put on there was 2018. They said, I will get my weight down below 180. And of course, everybody knows that weight loss is the first thing people resolve. 2019, they says, I will watch my calories until I get below 190. In 2020, they said, I will follow my new diet religiously until I get below 200. In 2021, they says, I will try to develop a realistic attitude about my weight. That's the truth. Then they added this last one. 2018, I will try to go to church every Sunday. 2019, they said, I will try to go to church every other Sunday. In 2020, they says, I will try to go to church once a month. In 2021, they says, I'll make it to church, I hope, on Easter and Christmas. I hope, if resolutions for what they are, if you have to make one, I pray that you'll make one, that you make a desire to be in God's house every time that you possibly can. And I know that the Lord can meet us outside of being here together, but I just want to encourage you to get together, to be in God's house. And I appreciate those that are joining us online, but I do know this. There's something about being together in the house of the Lord that's beautiful, and I love it. I just want to challenge you and encourage you to come and be here as much as you can in 2022. Praise the Lord. I was laying in bed. Deb and I were already in bed when New Year's Eve transpired into New Year's Day. Kind of halfway between awake and asleep when all of a sudden the fireworks began to explode. I didn't have to look at the clock to know the new year had arrived. Anybody can relate to that. I hadn't to roll and say it's new. I knew it by the tremendous amount of explosions everywhere. And they felt like they were never going to end. It just explosion. But I was laying there and I was listening to all of the fireworks going off. And I could not help but think in my own heart that what I was hearing, at least for me, was an outward expression of these inner feelings of being thankful that something had left and that something new had begun. With the fireworks exploding, I'm just listening to that, and I'm just speaking for myself, but we could almost hear in the sounds this emotional sigh, the sigh of relief of something passing, and the sense of joy and expectation of something new that was coming. I'm always amazed at the way we think at the changing of a calendar year. I think there's something very beautiful and almost emotional about it, because it's the opportunity, I believe, to start new again. Because believe it or not, there's nothing that anybody in this room can do to change anything that has happened in 2021 and behind us. Those days they've passed into the annals of history. You cannot go back and take back any word, any action, anything that has happened in the past, 2021 and beyond. You can't do anything to change it, but you can make the decision today to say, I'm going to be something different in 2022. And I am believing God that this is going to be the greatest year. I have new hopes and new dreams about new possibilities with God, and I do believe that this can be the greatest year ever. And I'm not saying that flippantly. Some of you say, well, Pastor Larry, you don't even know what I'm walking through right now. And you're right, I don't. But I know this, that God is still good, and if God is for me and he's not against me, then no matter what happens in this year, I know it can still be a brand good year. A great year. Because why? Because I know the God that I serve. I do know this, that this year brings me into a deeper relationship with Jesus. And if it helps me to have a greater love for my family, for my spouse, for my friends, for the people around me, for missions of the lost, if it helps me to value more highly the things that God has already given me, and to focus on the things that really matter, if I grow more in my faith, learn to trust Jesus more, if I'm able to use my testimony to see others blessed and redeemed from the things that I either walk through or the things that I do, then no matter what happens, no matter what comes this year, I know already it's going to be a great year. And here's the thing, this could be the very year that Jesus comes back to receive his church. This could be the year of the rapture when God comes back and redeems his bride. And wouldn't that make for a great year? Because I do believe Jesus is coming. I believe he's coming soon. And this could be the very year that Jesus comes. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I want us to turn there. I do have new hopes and new dreams about new possibilities for all of us. For God to impact your family, your home, this church, this community, and beyond for the glory of God. Back in about July or August, moving into September of 2021, I began to hear the Lord whisper something in my ear, deposit some things in my heart about 2022. And the word that the Lord, he kept speaking to me in my quiet time and my prayer and devotion time was just simply this word, intentional. I know we can put that up there. Intentional. I actually shared some of this, what the Lord was speaking to me, to our church staff and our board about September, October, November, about this word. God just kept speaking to me about be intentional. Debbie and I, my wife, we've talked about it often. And this past week, while I was pretty much home recuperating from Omicron, like so many, I tested positive a week ago Friday, which, would kind of put you out. But while I was home recouping, going stir crazy, because listen, being in quarantine makes you stir crazy. If you're like me, you like to be busy. But while I was quarantined, going stir crazy, barking like a seal, as my dad likes to say, I was sent this post by one of the ladies of our church, Teresa Roberts. Teresa and Barry, I don't know, I see them here this morning, but phenomenal couple, and we love them. They're such a blessing to our church. But Sister Karen Sanchez, she sent me their post because I had talked about this in our staff meeting, something I've been talking about. And she knows that I'm not a Facebook guy. That's not who I am. That could be a fault of mine. I apologize if it is, but that's just who I am. I don't get on there and see what everybody's doing. I'm not perusing so I can see what everybody's up to. My church staff, they know that, and there's something I need to know, they do let me know. But Sister Karen, knowing that we were home recuperating, knowing my lack of social media, she sent something that Sister Teresa had posted on her Facebook as a way of encouragement to us and to me to read while we were at home. And I want to read, because we asked Teresa if we'd be okay to read it, and she gave us permission to read her post to everybody here, so I'm going to read what she posted. She says, as I reflect over this past year, despite all the pain, loss, and hardships, God has truly blessed us. His grace has been sufficient in every situation. As we move forward into the new year, and as I pray for guidance for all that God has for me to do this year, there's one word that seems to resonate in my heart and mind. Intentional. What? I want to be intentional about loving others the way that Christ loves others. I want to be intentional about setting aside time to read the Word and pray and really hear from God. I want to be intentional about getting to know my neighbors better, building relationships so that I can reach them for Him. I want to be intentional about my health and taking care of this body that God has entrusted to me. I want to intentionally take the time to truly listen to others. God, please help me to be all that you want me to be. I am your willing vessel. You're so good to me. You have given me everything I need to live my life intentionally loving more, striving more, and being the person you want me to be. Intentional. I love that because that was the very thing that God had been speaking to me for months. To be intentional. Listen, friends, it's time. And this is what I feel like the Lord is saying. It's time for us to be intentional about every aspect of our lives. It's time that we get serious about what's going on both inwardly and outwardly and recognize that we just can't go through the motions when it comes to this flesh. But we have to be intentional about everything in our lives, from our faith to our family, to our friendship, to what we spend our free time doing, to what's going in our communities, in our schools, even in government, and the list goes on and on. It's time to become intentional and purposefully set our thoughts and our minds and our actions at seeing God do His best work in us and through us. Why? Because I do seriously believe that Jesus Christ is coming soon. Which is why it's so imperative that we become much more intentional about everything that we do. As the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, he says we're not just shadow boxing. He says we're actually running to win. We're running to win. You see, if there's a scripture that God has deposited in my heart for my life, what I feel is even for the church, is 1 Corinthians 9:24. Where the Apostle Paul writes, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. Don't you realize that in a race, every person runs, but only one person gets the prize? So you, all of us, run to win. I won't spend a lot of time here on the backdrop, but this verse actually comes on the heels of one of Paul's arguments about the reason why he does the things that he does in order to win people to Christ. He's writing to the church at Corinth, and this was a church that was very multifaceted. It was very multicultural. It had people that were Jews, that were Gentiles, it had those that were rich, it had those that were poor, freemen, slaves. They had all types of people mixed together, but they had a lot of problems in this church. They had a sin problem, they had a pride problem, they had a discrimination problem, lots of problems. And what was happening is that all these issues were literally beginning to cause fractures in the church. It was pulling them apart. It was tearing them apart. And they were losing their focus as to why God had redeemed them. Paul had already written to them once, as it says in 1 Corinthians 5:9, though we don't have a copy of that letter, it's been lost to us. But now he's writing to them again to try to get them to live in right relationship with Jesus, which ultimately would mean that they would live in right relationship with each other, both in the church and out of the church, in the home and out of the home. And friends, that's the key. If you're not in a right relationship with Jesus, you'll never be in a right relationship with your brother. You'll never be in right relationships, even at home, if you're not in a right relationship with Jesus. When this is right, this becomes right. Do you follow me? So he's writing to them ultimately to get them to live in a right relationship with Jesus so they'll live in right relationship with one another. Why? So that their testimony, the evidence of a changed life, would have the impact on those around them, in their homes, on their jobs, in their community, everywhere that they went. Paul is trying to help them to understand that Jesus, when he becomes the Lord of your life, he should change everything about us, inwardly and outwardly. As he says in 2 Corinthians 5:17, that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person, a new creation. The old life is gone and a new life has begun. We're changed. He wanted them to live an intentional life for Jesus in every aspect of their lives so that they would have the greatest impact possible on everyone around them. You see, intentional living for Jesus encompasses everything. It encompasses how we love our spouses. how we love our kids, how we love our friends, how we interact with our neighbors and our co-workers, the stranger that we meet at the park. It even impacts how we interact with leaders and legislators and governments itself. The point Paul is making is that we're to live this intentional life. And this life is to be an evidential witness to the transforming of power of Christ in our lives that so revolutionizes everything about us. That people, when they come to see us and they speak to us and they see us, they realize that our life is being lived on purpose. See, an intentional life requires us to think before we speak. An intentional life requires us to count the cost before we act. An intentional life requires of us to weigh every idle word and deed on the scale of does it exalt the name of Jesus. There's a lot I want to say here, and I'm not going to finish it today, so come back next week. But in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is writing about what intentional living looks like, and he's talking about it from a personal perspective, from his own personal life. And again, his goal here is to spread the gospel, to see people come to know the transforming power of Jesus just as he had experienced it. Remember Acts chapter 9? Before Paul became Paul, he was actually known as Saul of Tarsus, and he was a Pharisee, a Pharisee's Pharisee, if you will, and he hated Christianity. He hated the gospel message. He hated everything about Jesus, and his goal was to eradicate Christians and to totally stamp out the gospel. He had held the coats of those when they stoned Stephen, the first Christian martyr. He was instrumental in bringing people and having them locked up and in prison and beaten. And on a Damascus road, Acts chapter 9, he's going to the city of Damascus, going to Damascus for the very purpose of having more Christians arrested, put them in shackles and stocks and bonds, bring them back to Jerusalem so that they could stand trial, so they could be beaten, so they could be in prison. And yet on that journey, the Bible tells us in Acts 9, beginning of verse 3, that even he gets arrested, but he's arrested by Jesus. And I love what it says because it says, as he was approaching Damascus on this mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. And he fell to the ground and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul asked, who are you, Lord? And the voice replied, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city and you will be told what you must do. And from that time on, Saul, who had been the greatest persecutor of the church, becomes Paul, the greatest evangelist of the church. And he began to live his life with intentionality. He lived his life with intentionality. He became intentional about everything he did. Every word that he said. Why? Because he understood that the only thing that could change a life, change a heart, change a city, change a community, change a culture would be to know Jesus. Listen to me. We can put laws on the books of our legislation. We can legislate laws from here till doomsday. But laws do not legislate behavior. They can't make a person act a certain way no matter what you put out there. The only thing that would change a heart is Jesus Christ. It's the change that comes from experiencing Christ from within. That's why Paul was so intentional about sharing Jesus, because he knows that you cannot, and he knew you could not change culture by legislating it. Do we need good laws? Absolutely. Do we need good government? Absolutely. But laws cannot legislate behavior. Only Jesus can change a heart. See, that's ultimately what Paul's saying. He's saying if you want to see change in your family, change in your workplace, change in the classroom, change in community, change in culture, then you do all you can to win people to Jesus. Look, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Look at verse 19. I want you to hear what Paul's saying because he's talking about the intentionality of his life. He says, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. He said, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law, even though I am not subject to the law. I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I could bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I will obey the law of Christ. And when I'm with those who are weak, I share their weaknesses, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news of Jesus and share its blessings. Paul is saying here that he would do anything, that he would go anywhere, he would pay any price, he would do any sacrifice in order to win as many people at any time to Jesus Christ, as long as he did not compromise the gospel. He's talking about living his life intentionally. My prayer is that all of us would decide in 2022 that we're going to live our lives intentionally. 6 times in this passage, Paul talks about doing everything to win some to Christ. Verse 19, may bring many to Christ. Verse 20, may bring the Jews to Christ. Verse 20, may bring those under the law to Christ. Verse 21, I live apart from the law that I might bring them to Christ. Verse 22, I want to bring the weak to Christ. Verse 22, I do everything I can to save some. Now, don't misunderstand Paul here. He's not talking about being a people pleaser, because if you know the Apostle Paul, if you've ever read anything about him, he was anything but a people pleaser. He was a God pleaser above all else. In fact, in Galatians 1:10, he writes and says, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. Listen, Paul would never be a thief to win a thief. He would never become a partier or a drunk or drug addict to win those kinds of people. He wasn't going to be chugging a few at the bar on Friday nights or Saturday nights just so he can try to make some connections and win some friends so he might witness to them. His message was solely about Jesus and the cross, and his life was totally committed to following him. But his methods of reaching people were different. He was living an intentional life, and he was being intentional about reaching others. Friends, I am convinced that if we are to impact our world and our culture for Jesus right now, it's going to require that we become a whole lot more intentional about the things that we do and the things that we say, and to adopt the same kind of attitude that the Apostle Paul had, which was a whatever it takes attitude. Whatever it takes. God, I'm willing, whatever it takes. And let me just say this. Before we make that kind of commitment, you need to realize that that's a very scary thing to say, because God's going to require something of us when we say that. But the only way that we're going to impact our community, reach our families, our schools, our neighbors, our friends, the lady at the bank, the guy at the fitness center, the culture, is that we become intentional about every conversation, about every interaction, so that, God willing, we will see some come to know Christ. Listen, the Apostle Paul, he knew that if he was going to achieve his passion, his desire, his goal of winning people to Jesus, to see cities and communities transformed, that he would have to be intentional about everything that he did. And knowing that, he recognized that he was probably going to have to give up some things. Because listen to me, to gain something, you got to be willing to give up something. Pastor James Merritt said he was going to have to give up some preferences, some privileges, and some prerogatives. But he was willing to do it. Why? So that he might win some. See, that's what intentional living requires. And that's what Paul is saying here in chapter 9. Even though I'm a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I live apart from the law so that I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness. For I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can, intentional, to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and to share in its blessings. Paul was about building bridges and breaking barriers. He wasn't about compromising the message he was preaching or the message he was living. He was simply about the willingness to make personal sacrifices. And the willingness to say, I'll give up my preferences. I'll give up my personal privileges that I deserve. I'll give up my prerogatives. Why? Because I want to win somebody for Jesus. In the United States, we're so built upon having our personal preferences met. If it's not the way I like it, then I just don't like it. Remember the battle between McDonald's and Burger King back in the day? Some of you are too young to remember that. McDonald's and Burger King going head to head, but McDonald's, you ordered a cheeseburger for them, you're going to get it just like it came. 2 pickles and all the little chopped up onions on the top. Burger King knew that, so they came out with their slogan. You know what? Remember it was the little jingle? Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders, don't upset us. Anybody remember that? Have it your way, Burger King. Back in the day, I liked Burger King over McDonald's because I didn't want no pickles and onions on my burger. And I hated going to McDonald's and having to scrape all those little things off, because inevitably one would still get stuck in there and I'd bite it, as a little kid. We like our preferences. We like our privileges. We like our prerogatives. We like the things that we like. But sometimes if we're going to win somebody, we got to be willing to lay those aside. Paul was intentional about everything he did in order to eliminate any hindrance, to tear down any wall, to break down any barrier, to remove any excuse so that he might bring some to Jesus. To share the gospel without compromise. He condescended to people's level in order to remove anything that would offend, anything that would unnecessarily grieve them, so he could share Jesus through his words and through his actions. He intentionally lived his life in such a way that he says, I'm willing to lay stuff down in order that I might gain somebody for Jesus. I like the way the Message translation actually speaks this chapter or this part. And I want to read it to you. I know it's our 3rd time to read it, but I want you to hear the way the Message puts it. It says, even though I am free of the demands and expectations of everyone, I voluntarily become a servant to any and all people in order to reach a wide range of people. Religious, non-religious. Meticulous moralist to loose-living immoralist. The defeated, the demoralized, whoever. I didn't take on their way of life. I kept my bearings in Christ, but I entered their world and tried to experience things from their point of view. I've become just about every sort of servant there is in my attempts to lead those I meet into a God-saved life. I did all this because of the Message. I didn't just want to talk about it. I wanted to be in on it. I wanted to run to win. See, Paul wasn't willing to sacrifice the Message, but he was willing as the messenger to be sacrificed if it would bring somebody to Jesus. In effect, Paul said, I have placed myself under the bondage to every person who does not know Jesus Christ, that I may win as many people as I possibly can. What he's saying is that he had voluntarily relinquished his rights, his liberty, and his freedom in order to be a slave to those who did not know Jesus. He has this whatever it takes attitude of reaching everyone around him, those he came in contact with. Why? So he might see people and cities and community and culture transformed. His life was intentional. I always think about the great pioneer missionary David Livingstone, and some of you will know that name. David Livingstone was born in Scotland, a brilliant man. He could have done anything he wanted to do. He studied Greek, he studied theology, studied medicine, and graduated from the Glasgow University in Scotland with a degree in medicine. And one day he was in a place listening to a guy by the name of Robert Moffat, who was also a missionary to Africa, speak. And Robert Moffat, he spoke about it. He said this. He said, often I have looked to the vast plains of the north from the southern tip of Africa, and I have seen the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been. And it stirs something in David's heart. Here was a man who could have done anything. He could have pursued money, riches, fame, popularity. He was brilliant. But that day, listen to Robert Moffat. When he said that, something stirred in David's heart, and David thought to himself, 1,000 villages, no gospel, no missionary. God, if you'll send me, I'll go to Africa. And he did. He left from Scotland, laid aside his preferences, his privileges, and prerogatives, and he went to that continent. It wasn't long he lost use of an arm after a huge lion had leapt upon him and clamped its teeth onto his shoulder and crushed it. But while he was recovering, he met a young lady by the name of Mary, which was actually the missionary Robert Moffat's daughter. And they ended up getting married. Together they had 5 children. One day they were crossing the vast plains of Africa when one of the children got sick and died. And he made the decision right there, the hardest decision of his life. He says, I can't live like this. So he sent his wife and his other 4 children back to Scotland. And for the next 5 years, he did not see his wife or his kids. Think about that. Today we've got cell phones. Today we can call. We can send a quick email. We can FaceTime. We can Zoom. We can do all these things. But for 5 years, he didn't see their face. He didn't hear their voice. Letters would have to come by the transatlantic shipping. And they were very sparse and few in between. After 5 years, he finally comes back to Scotland for a time to recuperate. He walks into their house in Scotland, and when he gets there, the house is empty because they've left and they've gone to the funeral. They're burying David's father. And when he realized and finds out what's happened, they say that he collapsed on his floor and he wept like a baby. Because why? Because he's given all this up to gain something. After a short time of recouping, he went back to Africa. And once again, it would be years and years before he would ever see his family again. He finally received a letter from Mary. The kids are all grown, she said, and I'm coming to join you with the intent that they would spend the rest of their lives together spreading the gospel in the inner continent of Africa. She crossed the ocean. She traveled up rivers and streams until finally when she got there, she was so weak and frail from the journey, she had contracted malaria. David used everything in his medical power to cure her. He prayed and prayed and prayed over her, but she died. He buried her body underneath an African tree, and when he finished placing the marker there, he fell down on that dirt ground, and once again he cried. He wrote in his journal that day, my Jesus, my King, my life, my all, I again dedicate my whole self to thee. I shall place no value in anything I possess or in anything I may do except in relationship to the kingdom of Christ. He's making the decision to live an intentional life. Why? Because it's worth it. He continued into the jungle until he came upon another group of natives who stole his food, stole his goats, and worst of all, they stole all of his medicine. He felt like it was a death sentence, and he falls to his knees and he says, God, you know I'll die without the medicine. Livingston had not seen a white man in 5 years. And now right in the middle of the African jungle, on his knees, crying out to the Lord, he looks up and he sees this man walking towards him, white man carrying an American flag. His name was Henry Stanley, sent by the New York Herald at that time to try to find this legendary missionary that nobody had been able to see in years. And of course, you have the great legendary line, the first thing that Stanley said to him, Dr. Livingston, I presume. Stanley had been sent to find him, and once to finding him, he spends 4 months with him. Stanley was an atheist who bragged about it, but after 4 months of living with David Livingstone, seeing the intentional life that he lived, the compassion, the care that he had for people, he gave his life to Jesus. When Stanley was leaving Africa, he begged David to go with him, but David refused. David plunged deeper into the African jungle, becoming more and more frail with each passing day. For months, all he had to eat was maize, and eventually all of his teeth loosened and fell out. He now had boils and lacerations all over his feet, and he could no longer even walk. In his last days, he was carried by a stretcher from village to village, where his friends would prop him up against a tree, and he would preach the gospel to all who would listen. They say that on the day that he died, he managed with strength to crawl out of his cot and kneel next to his bed. And when they found him kneeling, he had gone on to be with Jesus. Upon his death, Britain requested his body be returned for proper burial. But the people in the village, they didn't want to send his body. Finally, they relented. They sent it back to Britain. Two of his friends carried his body back to Zanzibar, and they shipped it back to England, but not before they took out his heart. Attached to his body, they sent back a note that said this: you can have his body, but his heart belongs to Africa. Today, his body rests in Westminster Abbey, but his heart is buried underneath a mulva tree in Livingstone Memorial in Zambia. Dr. Livingston left behind a legacy. He played this prominent role in spreading the gospel into Africa. He made geographical discoveries. He was instrumental in ending the slave trade in East Africa. Listen, I have stood at the grave marker of David Livingstone in Westminster Abbey. I remember when we were walking through it, Debbie and I was trying to find it because that was one of those ones I wanted to find. Where's his marker? And I remember I couldn't find it. I looked everywhere, and finally I went to one of the curators. And I said, can you tell me, where's David Livingstone's marker? Where's he buried? And they showed me, and we walked, and we found it right in the middle of the Abbey, right in the middle of the floor. And it was so amazing that when we were coming to that spot, they were actually having a church service in a little small section area where his body laid. I've also stood in Stone Town, Zanzibar, at the place where the last East African trade market was at. Today there's a church that's been built on this spot where they would bring them up and they would literally auction them off. Today there's a church built upon that spot, and right next to that spot there's a cross that's made of the tree from which his heart was buried underneath. David lived his life intentionally. And you want to know the impact that he had? 25 years after David died in 1873, there weren't just 1 million Christians in Africa. There were now 10 million. Fast forward to the year 2021, and today there are 630 million Christian believers in Africa. That's 2 of the whole United States put together. Do you understand that? That's 2 of the United States, every person that put together. And they say by the year 2025, there'll be over 700 million believers in Africa. Why? Because a man said, whatever it takes, I'll do anything. I'll go anywhere. I'll pay any price. I'll lay aside my preferences, my prerogatives, and my privileges if I can just win some. He was intentional. And my prayer is, God, let that be the heart that we have to be intentional. If we're going to see our families change, if we're going to see our schools change, if we're going to see our jobs change, then we got to become intentional about every conversation and every word that we say, every action that we do. I'll jump more back into this next week, but verse 24, right, Paul writes this. Don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize. So run to win. Paul's goal in running was winning. It was to win. He said run to win. He didn't say run to compete. He didn't say run to look good in your running shoes and your shorts. I've never been a good loser. I've gotten better the older I've gotten. But I can tell you right now, when I play a game, I still play to win. I just tell you right now. If I'm going to play a game, I'm going to play to win. I'm not playing just to play. I'm playing to win. There's a game that Debbie and I play at the house often. She's on like a 10-game win streak, and it's getting a little discouraging, I'll be honest with you. Just telling the truth. Paul said, run to win. But we've got to determine in our own heart, what does that win look like for us? Because for Paul, it's more than just getting to heaven. That's not the win that's not the ultimate what Paul is saying. When he says run to win, he's actually speaking of something more. He's speaking of making an impact. Run to win. He was following Jesus, who had that same fervency. I love what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrew 12. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, he says, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. And we do this keeping our eyes upon Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding his shame. And now he is seated in the place of honor besides God's throne. Jesus ran to win, and he won. And he says to us that we also are to run to win. Run to win. Run to win. We're not just going through the motions. Verse 25 and 26. We're not just punching the air, shadow boxing. We're running to win. It's seeing the finish line, the task at hand, and being so laser focused that we're willing to give everything we've got, leaving nothing in reserves. As William Borden says, no retreat, no reserves, no regrets, but doing everything we can to save some, everything we can to spread the good news and share in its blessings. That's in the home, that's out of the home. That's at work, that's at school, that's with friends, that's with strangers. It's about being intentional. Being intentional. That's me for 2022. That's our church. I want to be intentional about everything because I want to see people, their lives changed. I want to see our community changed. I want to see culture changed. Are laws important? Should we be involved in law making? Absolutely. We have a right. We need to be voting. We need to be doing our part. But laws will not legislate the heart. Only Jesus can change it. Teresa wrote, I want to be intentional about loving others the way Christ loves others. I want to be intentional about setting aside to read the word and to pray. And we got prayer starting tonight at 6. And I really hear from God. I want to be intentional about getting to know my neighbors better, building relationships so that I can reach them for him. I want to be intentional about my health and taking care of this body that Christ entrusted to me. I want to be intentional about taking the time to truly listen to others. God, please help me to be all that you want me to be. I'm your willing vessel. You are so good to me. You've given me everything I need to live my life intentionally, loving more, striving more, and being the person you want me to be. Intentional. I watched a film last week, and I want to encourage everybody to watch this film. You'll have to buy it or rent it because it's only available right now on Amazon Prime. And even on that, you have to rent it. It's not free on there. You have to rent it. But it's entitled Free Burma Rangers. Free, F-R-E-E. It's not free. You got to rent it. It's Free Burma, B-U-R-M-A, Rangers. Dave and I watched that. And I won't say anything about it other than David Eubanks. It's a documentary more than anything. But I remember when I got through watching that, I looked at Devin, and Devin and I both had the same. It's like we're not doing enough. We've got to do more. Anybody seen that film? Anybody seen it? Free Burma Rangers? Anybody? Man, I'm not even getting royalties for this. I'm just telling you. Francis Chan, one of the executive producers of it. But I watched it and I got through, and Devin and I was looking at each other. It's like, we're not doing enough. Pastor Johnny texted me after he saw it, and he says, I feel lukewarm. And I understand the context when you watch it, the context of what he is doing, we can't do. But what it spoke to me is this, that we can do something within context where we are. We can look at where we have the gifts and the talents and the abilities, and we can say, God, use me intentionally where I am to impact culture in such a way that it changes things. And that can only happen through Jesus working in us. Paul said to the Jews, I live like the Jews. I observe the law, though I'm not under the law. He's talking more about their festivals. He's not talking about the law, 10 commandments here. With the Gentiles, I don't follow the Jewish law. Basically, to put it this way, with the Jews, he would not eat pork barbecue. He would eat beef barbecue. With the Gentiles, he would eat pork barbecue. If I can put it in a very basic way to understand. But he says, I do all that I do in order to win some. Stand together. "2022 is here. And I'm asking God to help me live my life intentionally, with intentionality. So when you go to work tomorrow, or you go to school tomorrow, that you've already thought about what you're going to say to that person who greets you and talks to you. You already have a mindset. That you're not going to think, you're not going to wait till you get there and just try to figure it out. You've already thought in advance, this is what I'm going to say, this is what I'm going to do. Why? Because you have a goal. You're running to win. You're watching online, listen to me, we're running to win. We have to determine what winning looks like for us. I understand that for some people, for them, winning will just be, I just want to make it to heaven. But if that's just the end goal, if that's all there is, then we're selling ourselves short and we're actually missing the great commission that God has called us to do. For some of us, we can get caught up in, for us, winning is having money. Winning's this, winning's that. But listen, all that stuff, everything we can keep, if winning's about having the corner office, about having the biggest house and driving the nicest car, then you're going to be very disappointed. Winning for me is seeing people, their lives changed, families transformed, people redeemed. And next week I'll start talking about the nuts and bolts about this intentional life that God has for us. But what I'm saying is that we've got to decide, we've got to make that commitment to ourselves, to the Lord, that says, God, help me to live intentionally, an intentional life, so that every action and every conversation, all that I do, it will be with the goal of leading people to you. This is my prayer. And I say that very sincerely. That's my prayer for me, because I need it. Because there's been a lot of times that I walked away and I said, I was not good at that. I failed that. I failed bad there. Can we find a place of prayer? I could give this big altar call, but I don't think I need that. I think if Jesus is Lord of our lives, and we desire Him, then we're going to say to ourselves, I want to win with Jesus. And winning with Jesus is seeing people's lives transformed. Then I think that His desire will become our desire. Can we find a place of prayer that we're making this consecrated commitment to the Lord? Maybe for you it's about receiving Jesus. I don't know. For the first time. Maybe for you it's about just confessing some sin and laying it aside, as it says in Hebrews 12:1, the sin that so easily entraps us and snares us and keeps us from doing and running the way God would have us to run. But for a lot of us, it's just about saying, okay, God, it's time for me to become serious about being intentional with my life. That I'm not just, it says in verses 25 through 27, I'm not just punching against the air, but I'm actually running to win. Let's pray. Let's find a place. Come on, all this building, let's find a place. Before we just rush out of here, let's find a place and get with God. Let's get with God. Thank you, Jesus.